Hi, Misha here. Want to talk about Egyptian Maadi AKs again? Yeah, I do. So let's do that. It's getting hot outside, and actually, recently, this spring, when we were testing a few other AKs, I did bring mine back out. One, just as kind of a control, because I knew it worked, and two, to let Fox run a mag or two through it, complete with the wire poker or fish fin stock, as he started calling it. Not incorrect. Gotta have him have the full experience. So we'll do that and just, have fun talking about this gun. And I'll explain why I actually kept a Postban over a Preban, and the pros and cons. Just, retreading but having fun talking AKs. As always, if you could, like, share, subscribe, and if it's possible, go over and check out the link to our Patreon. With that, yeah, let's dust this guy off. Fox's first time going Egyptian.
Walk like an Egyptian.
Truly, in military service, there were only two configurations. This one here, the folder, and the fixed stock. And also we have two different color pistol grips. Typically the kind of reddish brown goes with the fixed stock, and typically the blackish, very, very dark blue goes with the folder. And they use the same standard AKM rear trunnion. In fact, this is a very standard AKM. In fact, that was Maadi's main marketing point for these in the 80s and even into the 90s. But first, let's talk about why and how Egypt started making Kalashnikovs. Following World War II, Egypt's political position actually went back and forth between, quote-unquote, the West, namely for them, Britain, and Russia, the East, several times. And actually, believe it or not, in the very early post-war period, Russia was more apt to support Israel, or at least the nascent state that would become Israel, and the West, because of Britain, more apt to support Egypt. But this would quickly flip around. In 1949, Egypt decided it wanted to stop relying on imported guns and to kind of build its own domestic industry. This is where the FN-49 kind of comes in. But in 1952, the King Farouk, was deposed. And then 2 years later, the British themselves were formally kicked out. And this is when Anwar Sadat would come into play. And in 1956, an interesting event happens. Now, the AK was not even the first gun chambered for 7.62 by 39 to be not only used, but manufactured within Egypt. In fact, not even the first to be manufactured. It would become known as Factory 54, the Maadi factory, outside of Cairo. The Rashid. In 1956, Egypt approached Sweden to purchase tooling and plans for small arms, because Sweden was nominally neutral. And they would acquire the AG-42 line, the Jungmann line, as we know it in the West, although it's not its real name. And while the Hakim was the main production at Factory 54, they would also build a small number, around 8,000, of the Rashid, around 1960, 61, 62, in that kind of time frame. And these were chambered for 7.62 by 39, meaning that Egypt would also start producing that cartridge. Because after the Suez Crisis in 1956, Egypt would definitely be swinging more towards the COM bloc. And so while this was a limited production based on the Swedish tooling, it would directly lead to the AKM coming to Egypt here. Around 1962, Egypt would become involved in Yemen, first just sending a few thousand troops, but by 65, this had grown to over 55,000, and it was still going on in 67. And in that same year, we had the 6-Day War, again with Israel. We don't know exactly when production of the AKM started. It would now be known as Factory 54. But we do know that Egypt had several AKs in service by this time because many were captured by Israel, and they were used to make the Galil. Were these Russian? Probably a lot of them were. Were they Egyptian made? Hard to say, because in the beginning, at the Maadi factory, guns were put together using Russian parts. The process was, Anwar Sadat would send Egyptian experts into Russia to be trained. They would buy guns from Russia, and then they would come back. The tooling was transferred to the factory, and Russian overseers would help them assemble using Russian parts, and then transition over to making more and more parts in-house throughout time. So we get the AKM, or as it was known in Egypt, the MISR, MISR, or for export/police use, the ARM, which is basically just an automatic rifle MISR. So Egypt, so kind of the same thing, but also different. ARM typically means export. MISR typically means Egyptian military use, much like the Hakim and Rashid had names more than designators. And what the Egyptian MISR or ARM was, it was pretty much a carbon copy of a mid to late 60s Tula AKM. There are tiny differences between Tula and HS production, and it's worth pointing out that this gun is the early pattern with early features. And they used the same type of mags. Actually, very, very few differences. Maadi!
Maadi.
You have a lightning cut front sight base. You have a machined gas block. Standard vent holes for an AKM. Standard tube. Standard laminate handguards, and if the stock round, standard butt stock. Standard 1,000-meter rear sight. Standard lightning cut bolt carrier. Standard rear trunnion. Should be machined as well, not the later cast. Standard mag catch. Internals. Standard rib top cover. Yeah, and standard 1.0 stamped receiver and standard forged front trunnion. And the barrel, well, it was standard too. Cold hammer forged, chrome line, 16¼ inches long, threaded 14x1 left hand. Fun fact, the Rashid was already threaded 14x1 left hand too. So very, very few differences. One was the pistol grip. This probably looks, either style, either color, very much like Russian, but it's actually a plastic material. These are actually pretty brittle grips. Now, there was rumors for years that the wood was actually sourced from Finland. No idea if that's true or not. I don't hear those much anymore, so probably not. One thing that's true, for sure, was the very thick, very gloopy paint with a phosphate layer of kind of gray finish underneath. That's actually very much Russian spec. When you look at Russian guns, you think of Segas with a nice, even, pretty finish. That's one way. But if you look at a lot of the 60s, 70s Russian AKMs, they too have gloopy paint. And that's just kind of part of the charm. Either you love it or not. Dimpled magwell, of course. And the magazines were basically copies of Russian steel ribbed. Although the Egyptian mags tend to have a little bit rougher spot welds. And the mag pouch was a pretty standard canvas 3-pocketer, although instead of having one small pocket and one large pocket for a cleaning kit and an oiler, these just have 2 large pockets for more versatility. Sure. Pretty standard belt. So yeah, and These were definitely being used, Egyptian production, in 1973 during the Yom Kippur War, another war with Israel. But by that time, the political situation had changed. Anwar Sadat really didn't feel like the Russians were giving him enough support. After the Suez Crisis, the 6 Days War, he did not feel like the Arabs were backing the right player. So in 1972, he kicked out the advisors at the Maadi factory as well as other Russians on his soil. There were also Russian aircraft operating out of Egypt, ostensibly as reconnaissance only, but there you go. And then after the Yom Kippur War the next year, relations with Russia, USSR, broke completely down, and a shift would be made over the decade towards allying themselves, not so much with Britain this time as the USA for the first time, which put them in an interesting position with Israel, which eventually led to pretty good peace accords between the two countries. But the Maadi factory would continue making, Maadis, ARMs, missers. And that kind of gets us to the 1980s, and really the first true AKMs in America as a semi-auto. As is famously known today because of the Wolverines, Steyr, at least the U.S. Steyr company, was the first to import these. In 1982, between 2,000 and 2,500 came in from Egypt, and they played up the made-on-Russian tooling aspect to the nth degree, as they should. Why not? They even sent a certificate of authenticity with them, and extra mags, and a sling, and all that. They also charged a pretty penny. How much? Well, around $700 in 1980s dollars. Now, this was slightly before the Chinese guns had come around, but the Chinese guns would soon come around. This is why it took them a good part of the decade to sell off their stock. They were considered interesting and true AKMs. I mean, the differences between this and a Russian are basically with the fit and finish. The Egyptian guns are a little sloppier. Mine's got a little bit of cant here where it's welded, and the furniture. But it's a Russian. And in fact, one of the key features here is on the side, or rather what's not here. One of the other candidates for best AKM import would be the SAR-1, and it's a really good one, except it has a phosphate finish and it has a side scope rail. Great for shooting, but not exactly correct for an AKM. So that was really the only batch in the 80s, except around 86, a tiny company called Interport brought around 50 of the ARMS Samato in. And that's the same gun, but with the folding stock. And this is actually an interesting story for the folding stock because it actually introduces us to East Germany in the whole system. Going back to 72, East Germany introduced the MPI M72, which was their update for the AKM, which they called the MPI KM. It could be had with a fixed stock, but it could also be had with a new pattern of side folder. Now, that's the more wiry style, but what was great about those was they were flexible. They fit a standard rear trunnion, same as a fixed stock. So while not as comfortable, just ask Fox, and not quite as short, because you do have this block hanging off the back, they were easy to produce and you could swap between. Well, after the Egyptians got rid of the Russians, they still needed some technical assistance and they still needed some trade and whatnot, so they dealt with the DDR, East Germany, so some East German elements, namely that stock, came into play. I should also point out that Egypt was very happy to export to other countries, be it full autos to militaries or semi-autos to Americans. In fact, that was the plan going back to the late 40s. They wanted to be like the region's gun maker because, hey, they're Egypt and they're the oldest civilization in that area besides Mesopotamia, which really doesn't exist anymore. Although Iraq might say something about that. I just wanted to point out that this unique stock came from East Germany, but they did simplify it, namely giving it this stamped rear section and a very straight strut versus curved. So they did find ways to make it cheaper to mass produce. So either way, a couple of thousand in the 80s. Why don't I own one of those? Why do I have a Postban. So how do you like that stock?
It honestly kicks like a rabid mule. You ever seen a rabid mule?
Is it a mule? Aren't they all rabid?
Yes, or alpacas.
How about a rabbit mule?
That's not bad either.
I wonder how they are for eating.
They can't be too bad. I mean, we do enjoy the chili.
Alpaca.
Nothing wrong with it.
Hey, YouTube, you ever tried alpaca?
Alpaca chili, it's a thing.
It's what Dave Thomas uses.
So yeah, everything is extremely tight. And of course that could be the little fish fin I've got going on here, but it did seem like with each shot there was a whole lot of punch to that. But also this gun, it honestly shot like it had never been shot before. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. Very springy, very tight. I mean, it's all there.
That's because Steyr Prebans are ridiculously expensive. And there's only one real difference. The bayonet lug. And that's just not that big of a deal to me. Speaking of bayonets, this is the pattern that Egypt manufactured. This isn't Egyptian, but it's the same style. It's a hybrid AKM bayonet. We have an AKM so-called Type 1 scabbard and Type 2 bayonet itself. So that I mentioned that. So yeah, the lug is the only real difference. And the way they chose to demill this is very, very minor. They left the block on and the cleaning rod retaining brackets, whereas other importers did not. So, this is an N-Track. We had two importers, N-Track and Pars. And they both brought in guns in 1993. For you see, in March of 1989, George H. Bush signed an executive order prohibiting the importation of so-called assault rifles. And they defined them not only by name, but also by characteristics. At that time, a standard magwell was not one of the characteristics. And all that Egypt did, they didn't even change the name, for this one at least, ARM, from their Preban. They just removed the original stock and grip and put on a thumb hole. Still being a square back. Easy to reverse that. And in the front, at least the original versions, still retained 14x1 threaded barrels. Threaded barrels should not have been allowed through the 89 importation, but the way they get around this, they simply tack welded. You can see a little leftover weld there. The device in place, and boom, after you shaved off the wings to the bayonet lug, it was compliant post-1989. In fact, you can still even stick the bayonet on. Well, sort of, just don't go fighting with it. In fact, here it is on. It's very much on there. Now, if you started jiggling it back here, it would pull down, but horizontally it's latched on, so the wings aren't there to retain it in the vertical, but on the horizontal, it's on there and it fits quite tight. So that's neat. For looks, it's there, and I'm just not willing to pay the crazy extra money just to have a working lug, because, well, like I said, the fit and finish on these is not fantastic. It is what it is. It's very military. You either love it or you hate it. But the Prebans really weren't any better, despite what you might hear. But, yeah. Let's check in with Fox and see what he thinks of these. So, if you can remember back, what do you think Maadi compared to the SAR-1 you shot last time?
Man, this Maadi's got a little bit of punch, a little bit more punch to it.
Yeah.
But I don't know. It would need to be something I can compare them side by side. It has been a little bit and a lot of gunshot in between then. All I can think of right now is how punchy this is. But then again, it does have a small fish fin back here. But this gun is absolutely beautiful. It looks a lot better than it kicks.
That could have been nice and put on the fixed stock, but what fun would that have been? We didn't run many rounds to it just because it works and I have other AKs. I just brought it out just in case that day and figured, why not do another updated video on it? Why not? So yeah, when it comes to the early Postbans, with the Intrak, you had the ARM, 16-inch barrel, pretty much exactly this style. At least mine and most I've seen have the 14 millimeter threads. There was also the RPM, which was this, but with a 20-inch barrel. And the first batch in 93 also came with a bipod. They were trying to make them kind of look like an RPK, hence the name, but they weren't. They were just an AKM with a longer barrel by 4 inches. Yay. As far as I know, Egypt never made the RPK at all. But, okay. Pars also imported the ARM 16-inch barrel. I don't see as many of the Pars with the threaded barrel, although I've definitely seen some Pars ARMs. Now, they also did the RML in both 16 and 20-inch from Pars, and those do not seem to have threaded barrels. It seems like the threads were shaved off. And again, both these importers lasted until about 95. At least that's the last date on the trunnion. So meaning they were probably selling off what they had through 96. And finally, both realized they've got to drop the price. Luckily, they're still able to accept standard mags and still ship with typically 1 to 3. But, well, good things never last. In 1997, two things happened. One, Century Arms started importing the Egyptian AKM semi-auto 762x39 as the MISR, M-I-S-R. Again, that was the name used by the military, so it's kind of cool. Both names have validity, ARM and MISR. RML and RPM, not as much, frankly, to my mind. But also late that year, the Clinton administration started re-examining the 89 executive order from Bush, and in early 1998 decided to do the, hey, me too, and added more names to the actual ban list, and added one critical feature, the magwell. Previously, it didn't matter what mag a gun accepted to be imported. Now it would. So Century imported a small batch of MISRs, much like this, except no barrel threads. I've heard a few reports of the very earliest Centuries maybe having threaded barrels, but most don't. But then they had to change things up and go to the MISR 10, which is exactly what you think. It was this gun, thumbhole stock, no threads, with a slim magwell. You could cut it out to take high cap mags, but a lot of people that did, including Century later on, did it pretty half-assed. Meh. This would give way to a slightly better gun, the MISR SA. And that was really the final semi-auto we would get from Egypt. Those were coming in around 99, 2000, 2001, around the same time as the Romanian SAR-1, which is what I saw back when. They were the same treatment as the SAR-1 too. Now this was during the federal assault weapons ban 94 to 2004, so they couldn't have threaded barrels, bayonet lugs anyway, but they could put on a fixed stock and a pistol grip, and they could have them accept standard magazines if they put some U.S. parts on, including the pistol grip and trigger group. This is the MISR SA again. Interestingly, those guns, at least the ones I saw, didn't have a standard butt plate, steel butt plate with trapdoor. They actually had a kind of rubberized butt plate that said Maadi on them or something like that, or MISR. Had words on it. So it's kind of funny that they had a sportery butt plate on them. Of course, that stock was added here after taking off the thumb hole. But, yeah, the MISR SA came around, and they were good. Probably a good value for a long time. The ones to avoid, I repeat this in a lot of videos, but it's always worth repeating, are the MISR 90s. Also from Century, these are the ones where they took Egyptian receivers and plugged them together with Chinese barrel assemblies and whatnot. And the big problem is there, not only are the rivets in the wrong locations between the two guns, the journal, the hole the barrel goes in, is totally different. So they're a horrible mutt. Not only are they not collectible, they're not necessarily all that great. even if they're safe, which some may not be, where's the accuracy going to be? Just avoid danger. And that was really it for the Egyptian Misr or ARM. And I don't believe that Egypt is producing new ones today. Although the AKM, the Misr, is still very much in Egyptian service. And just a few years ago, they actually refurbished some of their rifles with assistance from Poland. So they're still keeping around. I should point out that they only made them in 7.60 by 39. They never even thought about switching to 5.45 by 39. And they never really did a 223 or 308 or anything like that. Pretty standard. A couple of very barrel length differences, a couple of stock differences, but that's really it. Kind of boringly consistent. But that's good, because if you want an AKM as an import, it really is harder to find. You really can't find one better than this compared to a Russian. I'm not saying this is a better gun. In fact, I would rate the Hungarian, definitely the Preban Yugo, probably even the Romanian, maybe, depending on the day of the week, over the Egyptian. But that's only judging them on fit and finish. As Fox pointed out, this is a tight gun, even years later. It is springy, little thumpy, but part of that's the stock. The trigger is a military trigger. So they're very reliable and dependable. No problems there. And as far as the paint and wood look, either you love it or you don't. This is a true military AK. It does not look commercialized at all, which I personally really respond to. The Maadi factory has done these both with more Western markings, more anglicized, and more Arabic, kind of just depending on who's buying them. And even if the guns stopped coming in well over 20 years ago, about 10 years ago, a pretty decent batch of parts kits came in, fixed and folding stocks. Now, unfortunately, because of the 2005 ban prohibition on barrels under Bush W administration, they couldn't come in with their original barrels, sadly. But since they were standard AKM, there were Romanian and Polish barrels available for the kits if you wanted to. And of course, they fit onto a standard 1mm receiver. A Nodak or a Morrissey would be just fine. Or you could do a Childers with Egyptian markings. So there are some parts kits around that are a good option if you don't want to pay for an import. And I'm not sure, even with what these go for today, I would either. For a long time, these were undervalued, way undervalued. And now people have kind of cottoned on to it. But, yeah, I always like having as close as I can get to the military guns, AK-47, AKM, AK-74, etc. And this is the representative there. It's not my favorite, but it really fills that niche very, very well. And Egypt did use these in many conflicts. They used them against Lebanon in 77. They used them in the 80s, and they used them through various campaigns into the 21st century. So there is a definite history there, and you can tell that this started off as a comm block era factory and a military factory, not a civilian. No one would ever mistake a Maadi for a civilian gun, and at the end of the day, that's cool to me. May not be to you. So, let me know what you think. And if you have any more information, please do let me know, because as famous as these guns are, there's not a ton of information out there on them, sadly. As always, if you could, please do like, share, and subscribe. If you'd like to help Fox and I out, check out the link to Patreon. And we'll catch you very soon next time.